Picture this. You're standing in the smoking ruins of your family home at 4 a.m. watching your HOA president, let's call her Delilah, actually laughing with the fire marshal while pointing at your destroyed workshop. "I warned everyone about those dangerous chemicals," she says, loud enough for the news cameras to hear. The acrid stench of melted plastic mixed with the bitter smell of 80-year-old woodworking tools going up in flames. My grandfather's hand-carved workbench, the one that survived World War II, was now a pile of charcoal and twisted metal. Here's the kicker. Delilah had no idea she'd just committed felony arson against a municipal court judge. 7 days later, she'd be standing in my courtroom in handcuffs, begging for mercy from the same man whose life she'd tried to destroy. And oh, the irony was chef's kiss perfect. What would you do if someone burned down everything you owned and then celebrated on live TV? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this revenge story involves federal prison time. Let me take you back 6 months before the fire, when life was actually pretty good. My name's Judge Ezra Hawthorne, and at 52, I just landed my dream job as municipal court judge in Millbrook Heights, Colorado. After 20 years as a public defender watching the system chew up working families, I finally had a chance to make things fair from the other side of the bench. The best part? I'd inherited my grandmother Iris's 1940s craftsman house in the Pinecrest HOA community. This wasn't just any house. It was 4 generations of Hawthorne family history wrapped in cedar shingles and memories. Grandmother Iris had raised me there after my parents died in a car crash when I was 12. Every creaky floorboard told a story. Every family photo on the mantle was irreplaceable. But my real sanctuary was the detached garage workshop. The rough bark of the massive oak tree my grandfather planted in 1943 scraped against the workshop's tin roof when the wind blew, creating this rhythmic tapping that meant home to me. Inside, grandfather's Wabi-Bo-Poo-era woodworking tools lined the walls like museum pieces, hand planes smooth as silk from decades of use, chisels sharp enough to shave with, and that magnificent workbench he'd built by hand in 1946. Pinecrest was the kind of neighborhood where kids still rode bikes on cracked asphalt, and the smell of barbecue smoke drifted through screen doors on Saturday evenings. 45 homes built between 1940 and 1960, mostly working families who'd lived there for decades. It was perfect. Then Delilah Voss moved in. Picture every HOA horror story you've ever heard, add a California accent and a white BMW, and you've got Delilah. At 58, she'd relocated from some gated community in Orange County and immediately decided our little slice of heaven needed upgrading to modern standards. She wore designer athleisure-like armor and spoke in that fake sweet, passive-aggressive tone that could make "have a blessed day" sound like a death threat. Within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency and started her campaign of systematic harassment. Her first target? My workshop. The violation notice appeared on my door like a subpoena from hell. Detached garage workshop activities violate residential use-only covenant. Daily fine, $50, escalating to $200 if not remedied within 72 hours. Here's the thing, and this is your first legal nugget. HOA covenants often contain grandfather clauses that protect existing uses when new restrictions are added. My workshop had been operating continuously since 1946, 20 years before the current HOA bylaws were even written. The takeaway? Always research the history of restrictions before accepting them as valid. But Delilah wasn't interested in legal technicalities. When she discovered I was the new municipal judge, she clip-clopped up my front porch in her designer heels like some demented fairy godmother. The sharp click-click-click on the wooden boards announced her arrival before she even knocked. "Surely a judge wants to set a good example for the community," she purred, her smile as warm as a cobra's. "We simply can't have judicial officers flouting neighborhood standards." I maintained my ethical boundaries, explaining that my position had nothing to do with HOA disputes, and that I expected to be treated like any other resident. Her perfectly veneered smile never wavered, but her eyes went dead cold. That's when I knew this wasn't about workshop noise or property values. This was about power, control, and putting the new judge in his place. The community dynamics were telling. Mrs. Olivia, the 78-year-old widow next door, would whisper support while weeding her garden, but was too scared to speak publicly. The Kowalski family, blue collar with 3 kids, had already received foreclosure threats over their basketball hoop placement. Everyone walked on eggshells around Delilah, afraid to be her next target. But I wasn't everyone. I was a former public defender who'd spent 2 decades fighting bullies exactly like her. And frankly, she'd picked the wrong house to mess with. Delilah didn't waste time escalating. 3 days after our porch conversation, she filed a formal complaint with the city planning department, claiming my workshop was actually a commercial business operating without proper permits. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd submitted photographs taken with a telephoto lens through my workshop windows, complete with typed annotations pointing out evidence of commercial activity. Now, back in my public defender days, I'd handled dozens of zoning cases, so I knew exactly what she was trying to pull. The law is crystal clear. The difference between hobby workshops and commercial operations comes down to intent and income, not how fancy your equipment looks. You can own a $1,000 table saw and still be making birdhouses for your grandkids. What matters is whether you're advertising services or generating business income from the space. When City Planning Inspector Rodriguez showed up the next morning, I could practically smell Delilah's desperation wafting across the street. Rodriguez was a no-nonsense guy who actually appreciated craftsmanship. He ran his weathered hands along grandfather's hand-carved workbench, noting the dovetail joints that only come from decades of patient practice. "This is clearly personal hobby space," he told me, jotting notes on his clipboard. "No commercial signage, no customer parking, no business permits on file. Some people collect stamps, some people build furniture. Neither one's a crime." I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Delilah organized an emergency HOA meeting about commercial activities threatening residential character. The meeting notice went out with barely 36 hours warning, but she was gambling that most residents wouldn't know the HOA bylaws required 48-hour minimum notice. Only 8 of 45 homeowners showed up, and 4 of those were there to oppose her. The community center felt like a courtroom with Delilah as both prosecutor and judge, complete with a makeshift podium she'd dragged in from somewhere. "We need immediate action to protect property values," she announced, her voice bouncing off the cinder block walls with religious fervor. I motioned to pass an emergency resolution requiring pre-approval for all garage activities. Mrs. Patterson, the sweet retired teacher from Maple Street, raised her hand tentatively. "Does that mean I need permission to store my Christmas decorations?" "Reasonable storage would be exempted," Delilah replied with a straight face, completely missing the irony that her resolution was so broad it would technically require approval to park cars in garages. The vote passed 5-3, with our 4 opposition voices shouting about proper procedures. But Delilah had her victory, and the metallic bang of her gavel hitting the folding table sounded like a judge's death sentence. That's when I stopped playing defense and started thinking like the lawyer I used to be. I spent the following week buried in Colorado HOA regulations, cross-referencing statutes like I was preparing for the Supreme Court. What I discovered was beautiful in its legal simplicity. Delilah's emergency meeting had violated not 1, not 2, but 4 separate procedural requirements under state law. Emergency meetings can only bypass normal notice requirements if there's genuine, immediate danger to life or property. A hobby workshop didn't qualify unless she thought I was building bombs instead of birdhouses. My 12-page legal brief to the state HOA ombudsman cited every violated statute with the precision of a surgical strike. Filing fee, $50. The look on Delilah's face when she got served with my challenge, priceless. Her retaliation was swift and petty. Within 24 hours, grandmother's 1985 Buick had a parking violation notice slapped on the windshield, claiming it was an inoperable vehicle due to surface rust and faded paint. The car ran like a Swiss watch. I'd been maintaining it myself for 15 years, but it looked its age. As I traced my fingers along the familiar worn steering wheel, remembering driving lessons with grandmother in this same car, I realized this wasn't about the car any more than the workshop was about noise ordinances. The fine structure revealed her real strategy: $200 daily for the workshop, $200 for parking violations, $100 for general property appearance. Total, $500 per day. At that rate, she could force compliance or bankruptcy within months, a financial chokehold disguised as community standards. The psychological effect rippled through the neighborhood like a virus. The metallic clang of garage doors closing echoed down the street as neighbors started hiding their own equipment. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired mechanic, sheepishly moved his engine hoist into his basement. The Kowalski kids stopped playing basketball, their hoop folded against the garage like a white flag. But something else was happening too. Mrs. Olivia had started documenting everything with the precision of a research librarian, tracking which violations got enforced and which ones didn't. Her findings were revealing. Delilah's enforcement was surgically selective, targeting families with children, elderly residents, and working-class households while ignoring identical violations by her supporters. This wasn't about protecting property values. This was systematic harassment with a clipboard and a badge. I kept working in my shop every evening, the familiar smell of wood stain mixing with my growing determination. Every illegal fine was evidence. Every procedural violation was ammunition. And every day, Delilah was digging her legal grave a little deeper. Delilah's next move showed she understood power better than I'd given her credit for. Instead of fighting me directly, she went after my career. Her husband worked as a loan officer at First Mountain Bank, the regional institution that held half the city's development loans. Within a week of my HOA challenge filing, I started hearing whispers at the courthouse. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, just casual mentions that some community leaders had concerns about my ability to maintain judicial neutrality, given my confrontational approach to neighborhood disputes. The court administrator, a nervous man named Phillips who'd held his job through 3 different mayors, pulled me aside after a particularly routine traffic court session. The smell of burnt coffee from the break room clung to his polyester shirt as he shifted uncomfortably. "Ezra, I've got to ask, any truth to rumors about you intimidating HOA board members? Because people are starting to talk, and not in a good way." I could practically hear Delilah's voice behind those concerns. She'd weaponized my professional reputation, turning my legal knowledge against me. Fight back too hard, and I'd look like an abuse of judicial power. Back down, and she'd win through intimidation. Meanwhile, the workshop harassment escalated to outright sabotage. I'd come home from court to find power tools unplugged, ongoing projects knocked over, and grandfather's hand planes mysteriously dulled. The scrape of metal on concrete when I discovered his antique jointer plane damaged felt like fingernails on a chalkboard, and on my soul. No witnesses, no proof. Just coincidental accidents that happened to occur during Delilah's evening constitutional walks through the neighborhood. But she wasn't just targeting me anymore. Mrs. Olivia received a violation notice for excessive garden decorations. Apparently 3 garden gnomes violated some newly discovered aesthetic standard. The Kowalski family got cited for children's toys in front yard after their kids left sidewalk chalk on the driveway. I remembered a case from my public defender days where we'd proved harassment by documenting patterns rather than individual incidents. Colorado's harassment statutes don't require threats or violence, just a systematic pattern of conduct designed to intimidate or annoy. Each violation notice was a thread. Together, they wove a tapestry of systematic abuse. So I started building a case the way I'd been trained, methodically, legally, and with an eye toward trial. Security cameras went up on my property, carefully positioned to record only my own land, because I knew Delilah would challenge their placement. Every violation notice got photographed, dated, and filed in chronological order. Every conversation got summarized in writing within 24 hours. The irony was delicious when Delilah complained about my cameras at the next city council meeting. The same woman who'd photographed through my windows with a telephoto lens was now concerned about privacy invasion and hostile surveillance creating an uncomfortable neighborhood environment. Councilman Bradley, a former prosecutor, didn't hide his smirk. "Ma'am, security cameras on private property are perfectly legal as long as they don't record beyond property lines. Are you suggesting Judge Hawthorne doesn't have the same rights as other residents?" That's when the local newspaper picked up the story. Municipal judge in HOA dispute wasn't exactly Watergate, but reporter Sarah Kim had a nose for small-town corruption. Her initial article was balanced, presenting both sides, but I could tell she sensed something deeper. The media attention sent Delilah into overdrive. Suddenly, neighbors who'd never spoken to reporters were getting calls asking about judicial intimidation and abuse of power. The narrative she was spinning painted me as a bully using my position to circumvent community rules. But newspapers work both ways. When Sarah Kim started digging into HOA finances and board meeting minutes, she discovered some interesting patterns. Delilah's emergency resolutions had authorized $18,000 in legal fees from a Denver firm, expenditures that were never put to a board vote, let alone a membership vote. Mrs. Olivia's historical research proved invaluable here. The original 1962 HOA incorporation documents she'd discovered in her late husband's papers showed that major expenditures required membership approval. Every dime Delilah had spent on lawyers was technically embezzlement. The stakes were escalating beyond neighborhood disputes into potential criminal territory. HOA board members have fiduciary duties just like corporate executives. They can be personally liable for unauthorized expenditures, especially when those expenditures serve personal rather than community interests. Delilah's desperation became palpable. Late one evening, as autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves, she appeared on my porch again. This time, her designer composure had cracked around the edges. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Perhaps we could work out some kind of accommodation. I'm sure we both want what's best for the community." I looked at her through my screen door, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her leather purse. Fear has a distinctive smell, sharp, acidic, like metal left too long in rain. "The accommodation is simple," I replied calmly. "Follow the law. Respect people's rights. Stop the harassment." Her mask slipped completely then, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." She was wrong about that. I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I was building the case to prove it. Winter was approaching when Delilah played what she thought was her trump card. A formal complaint landed on Fire Marshal Thompson's desk claiming my workshop contained improperly stored flammable materials creating imminent fire hazard. The complaint was anonymous naturally, but typed on the same letterhead she'd used for previous violations. I actually chuckled when Thompson called to schedule his inspection. During my public defender years, I'd represented 3 contractors cited for improper chemical storage, so I knew fire codes better than most homeowners. My wood stains and polyurethane were stored in original containers, properly labeled with adequate ventilation and approved disposal methods. Everything was textbook perfect because I'd learned from other people's expensive mistakes. Thompson arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, his boots crunching on frost-covered leaves as he approached the workshop. The clean smell of properly ventilated workspace greeted us as I opened the doors, along with the satisfying sound of his boots on swept concrete floors. "Well, this is refreshing," he said, running his flashlight along my storage shelves. "Usually I'm looking at paint cans rusted shut since the Carter administration. You've actually read the fire codes, haven't you?" He found 0 violations and actually complimented my organization. But by then, Delilah had moved her campaign online. Her next-door posts started appearing like digital poison ivy. "Concerned neighbor here. Has anyone else noticed concerning chemical odors from Judge Hawthorne's garage workshop? With so many young families in our area, shouldn't we prioritize safety over personal hobbies?" The posts were masterfully crafted, plausible deniability wrapped in maternal concern. She never made direct accusations, just raised questions and expressed worry about outside influences changing our community character. That last phrase made my skin crawl with its barely concealed implications. But social media cuts both ways, and Pinecrest had deeper roots than Delilah realized. Longtime residents started sharing memories. Photos of neighborhood kids learning woodworking from my grandfather in the 1970s, stories about Iris helping families during the recession, testimonials about 3 generations of Hawthorns contributing to community life. Mrs. Patterson posted a particularly devastating response. "Ezra's grandfather taught my late husband carpentry skills that put food on our table during hard times. Some outside influences have been blessings to this neighborhood for 80 years. The comment thread turned into a digital pile-on that left Delilah's posts ratioed and her credibility shredded. But rather than retreating, she doubled down. An anonymous complaint appeared on the State Judicial Conduct Board's desk, claiming I was abusing judicial position to intimidate HOA leadership and creating conflicts of interest through personal legal disputes. The complaint was professionally written, clearly crafted by someone with legal knowledge. I knew the ethics rules backward and forward. Judges have the same rights as any citizen to defend themselves legally, as long as they don't use their position for advantage or create actual conflicts of interest. Since I'd already recused myself from any HOA-related municipal cases, there was no ethical violation. The Conduct Board dismissed the complaint after a cursory review, but the message was clear. Delilah was willing to attack my livelihood to win this war. That's when she made her most desperate gamble, calling for an emergency HOA meeting to authorize a $15,000 special assessment for a legal defense fund. The meeting notice claimed the money was needed to protect the community from legal harassment by hostile residents. The transparent money grab finally woke up the neighborhood. Kowalski organized a door-to-door campaign, and the sound of multiple doorbells ringing became the soundtrack of our quiet revolution. What we discovered was sickening. Over the past 3 years, 12 families had been driven to sell their homes through systematic harassment. Elderly couples, young families, working-class households, anyone who couldn't afford to fight back had been forced out. The pattern was surgically precise. Delilah would target vulnerable residents with escalating violations until they either complied completely or sold. Her husband's bank had financed 8 of those forced sales to investment buyers who just happened to flip the properties for significant profits. The night before the special assessment meeting, Mrs. Olivia knocked on my door carrying a shoebox full of documents. Her arthritic fingers traced property deeds and bank records as she laid out 3 years of systematic fraud. "They've been stealing our neighborhood one family at a time," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "Using the HOA like a weapon to drive down property values, then profiting from the foreclosures." The meeting was packed, standing room only in the community center. Delilah sat at her makeshift podium looking like a general whose army had deserted. When she called for the vote on her special assessment, the response was thunderous. "No!" But then something beautiful happened. Kowalski stood up, his calloused hands holding a petition signed by 34 of 45 homeowners. "We're calling for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally found his courage. "And we're demanding a complete financial audit of all expenditures for the past 4 years." I watched Delilah's face drain of color as she realized her reign of terror was ending. But I also knew she wasn't finished yet. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and this particular animal still had matches. The next morning, Mrs. Olivia appeared at my door with trembling hands and a manila envelope that would change everything. Her usually steady voice quavered as she pressed the documents into my palms. "I found these in Harold's old filing cabinet," she said, referring to her late husband who'd served as HOA treasurer back in the 1980s. "I think you need to see what this neighborhood was supposed to be." Inside were the original HOA incorporation documents from 1962, yellowed with age but legally pristine. As I spread them across my kitchen table, the coffee growing cold in my mug, I felt like an archaeologist discovering buried treasure. The original covenant language was crystal clear. Homeowners retain the right to pursue traditional residential activities, including but not limited to gardening, automotive maintenance, woodworking, and other customary household crafts within appropriate structures on their property. My workshop wasn't just grandfathered in, it was explicitly protected by the founding documents. Every fine Delilah had issued, every violation notice she'd written, every legal threat she'd made was based on covenants that had never been legally amended. But that was just the beginning. The incorporation papers required a 75% supermajority vote of all homeowners to amend the original covenants. Delilah's 2018 modernization of the rules had passed with barely 40% participation and simple majority approval. Her entire legal foundation was built on quicksand. I immediately called my former colleague, attorney Sarah Beth Morrison, who specialized in HOA law. Her sharp intake of breath when I read the original language told me everything. "Ezra, this is a nuclear bomb," she said. "If those covenants were never properly amended, every enforcement action based on the new rules is legally void. We're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands in illegal fines." The deeper we dug, the worse it got. The nervous HOA treasurer, a mild-mannered accountant named Peterson, finally found his courage and met me at a coffee shop downtown. The nervous tremor in his voice mixed with the hiss of the espresso machine as he revealed 3 years of financial manipulation. "She never brought the legal expenses to board votes," he whispered, constantly glancing around like we were planning a heist. "Just kept approving payments and telling us they were administrative costs. We've spent over $35,000 on her personal vendettas." But the real smoking gun came from county property records. Over the past 4 years, 15 families had lost their homes through foreclosure or distress sales. Delilah's husband's bank had financed 12 of those purchases by investment buyers, who immediately flipped the properties for 30 to 40% profits. The pattern was surgical in its precision. Target vulnerable families with escalating harassment, drive up their legal costs and stress levels until they couldn't fight anymore, then profit from the artificially depressed sale prices. It was financial predation disguised as community improvement. I spread the evidence across my workbench, the same workbench that had started this whole nightmare, and felt the weight of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just about HOA overreach. This was systematic fraud, potentially criminal conspiracy, and definitely a violation of federal housing laws. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Beth. Researched similar cases. Colorado RICO statute applies to ongoing criminal enterprises. If we can prove the pattern, we're looking at felony charges. That evening, as I sanded the hope chest I'd been restoring, one of grandmother's pieces that had survived Delilah's psychological warfare, the familiar smell of wood and the therapeutic rhythm of the sandpaper helped me process the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Delilah had picked the wrong neighborhood to terrorize, but more importantly, she'd picked the wrong judge to frame. Because now I wasn't just defending my workshop or my family's legacy. I was building a criminal case that would expose a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of families. The irony was perfect. She'd tried to use the legal system to destroy me, and instead had handed me enough evidence to send her to prison. The war room was my kitchen table, covered in legal documents, property records, and enough evidence to sink a battleship. Sarah Beth Morrison sat across from me, her laptop humming as she cross-referenced Colorado statutes with federal housing discrimination laws. The satisfying snap of her fingers on the keyboard punctuated our strategy session like a legal metronome. "Here's our problem," she said, pulling off her reading glasses. "You can't represent yourself because of judicial ethics rules, and frankly, this case is too big for one attorney. We need a team." That's how we assembled what I privately called the Avengers of HOA Justice. Sarah Beth brought in Marcus Olivia, no relation to Mrs. Olivia, a federal prosecutor who'd taken leave to handle high-profile civil rights cases. His specialty was using RICO statutes against organized criminal enterprises, which is exactly what Delilah's operation had become. The evidence organization alone took 3 days. Every violation notice, every financial record, every property deed had to be cataloged with chain-of-custody precision. We were building a federal case, which meant everything had to be bulletproof. Mrs. Olivia became our unofficial historian, spending hours at the county courthouse digging through property records dating back to 1960. Her arthritic fingers traced through deed transfers and mortgage documents with the dedication of a monk copying scripture. What she found was devastating. Delilah's pattern extended beyond our neighborhood to 2 other HOA communities where her husband's bank held significant loan portfolios. The community organizing happened organically. Kowalski's garage became our unofficial headquarters, the sound of folding chairs being arranged mixing with the voices of neighbors who'd finally found their courage. What started as 8 people in his cramped space grew to 23 residents sharing stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial pressure. Each story followed the same script: escalating violations for minor infractions, unauthorized legal fees assessed to individual homeowners, pressure to sell rather than fight. The Hendersons had been fined $3,000 for a garden gnome collection that predated the HOA's landscaping rules. The Patels faced foreclosure threats over a cultural holiday decoration that violated newly invented aesthetic standards. Our accountant volunteer, a retired IRS investigator named Dorothy Walsh, attacked the HOA financial records like she was auditing the mob. The rhythmic clicking of her calculator keys became the soundtrack of our investigation as she uncovered layer after layer of unauthorized expenditures. $53,000 in administrative costs over 3 years, she announced during one evening session, but the actual administrative budget approved by homeowners was $12,000 annually. Someone's been treating this HOA like their personal piggy bank. The media strategy expanded beyond our local newspaper. Sarah Kim's initial article had caught the attention of Denver television stations, and suddenly our small-town HOA dispute was becoming a statewide story about housing discrimination and financial fraud. I kept working in my shop every evening, partly for therapeutic reasons and partly as a symbol. The familiar smell of wood stain and the meditative rhythm of hand-planing reminded me why this fight mattered. This wasn't just about my grandfather's tools or my family's legacy. It was about every working family's right to exist in their own neighborhood without fear. During one late-night strategy session, Marcus pulled up the Colorado RICO statute on his laptop. "Look at this language," he said, highlighting key phrases. "Pattern of criminal activity designed to acquire or maintain control of an enterprise through illegal means." Delilah's been running a protection racket disguised as neighborhood improvement. The beauty of our legal strategy was its multiple attack vectors: civil rights violations under federal housing law, RICO charges for the organized conspiracy, state-level fraud charges for the financial manipulation, and good old-fashioned breach of fiduciary duty for the unauthorized expenditures. But we needed one more element: perfect timing. The annual HOA elections were scheduled for March, giving us a natural deadline for community organizing. More importantly, Delilah had scheduled a final disciplinary hearing regarding my workshop violations. She was too arrogant to back down even as her world crumbled around her. The ironic beauty was that she'd scheduled her hearing for the municipal courthouse where I presided. She had no idea that by the time she walked into that building, she'd be facing federal charges instead of delivering ultimatums. Our evidence boxes filled my garage, the same garage she'd tried to shut down. Financial records, security footage, witness statements, property deed research, and recorded testimony from 15 families who'd been driven from their homes. We had enough evidence to fill a small library. Mrs. Olivia knocked on my door one evening carrying homemade cookies and a satisfied smile. "Harold would be so proud," she said, referring to her late husband. "He always said someday someone would have to clean up this mess. I just never imagined it would be this thorough." The trap was set, the evidence was compiled, and the community was united. All that remained was watching Delilah walk into the legal ambush she'd spent 3 years creating for herself. Justice, it turned out, had its own workshop, and we'd been building something beautiful. By February, Delilah could feel the ground shifting beneath her designer heels. The hollow echo of her voice at increasingly empty HOA meetings told the story. Only 6 people attended her latest emergency session, and 4 of them were there to oppose her every motion. She was losing control, and desperation makes people dangerous. The workshop vandalism escalated from petty harassment to outright destruction. I came home from court one evening to find grandfather's 80-year-old wooden handplane split completely in half, its blades scattered across the concrete floor like shrapnel from an explosion. The heartbreak was physical. That plane had shaped wood for 3 generations, survived the Depression, 2 wars, and countless family projects. My security cameras had captured everything. 2 figures in dark clothing approached the workshop at 2:47 a.m., their faces obscured by ski masks. But infrared technology reveals more than people realize, and the distinctive tennis bracelet catching the camera's glow was unmistakably Delilah's, a $3,000 piece she'd worn to every HOA meeting for the past 2 years. The vandalism crossed the line from civil harassment into criminal mischief. Marcus Olivia reviewed the footage with the intensity of a federal prosecutor, which technically he still was. "This isn't just destruction of property anymore," he said, freeze-framing the image of the bracelet. "This is intimidation of a federal witness, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy. She's graduated from HOA bully to federal defendant." But Delilah wasn't done making mistakes. Her next brilliant strategy involved flooding city offices with anonymous complaints about various code violations at houses belonging to my supporters. Same handwriting, same letterhead, same transparent desperation dressed up as concerned citizen reports. The Kowalskis got cited for excessive children's toys in yard after their kids left sidewalk chalk on the driveway. Mrs. Olivia faced a landscaping violation for her prize-winning rose garden that had been featured in the local newspaper. Even the Patels, who'd kept their heads down for 3 years, suddenly had architectural inconsistencies in their front porch railings. City Planning Director Rebecca Martinez called me directly after the 15th identical complaint landed on her desk in 1 week. "Ezra, I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've never seen anything this blatantly retaliatory. These complaints are so frivolous they're actually insulting my intelligence. A rose garden is not a code violation. Sidewalk chalk is not permanent signage, and whoever wrote these needs to learn that I don't like it is not a legal standard." The pattern was so obvious that even city officials were documenting the harassment. Every bogus complaint became evidence of systematic retaliation against anyone who dared to support me. Meanwhile, Delilah's media campaign reached peak desperation. She granted an interview to the Denver Post where she actually claimed to be protecting the neighborhood from judicial abuse of power and standing up for ordinary homeowners against legal intimidation. The interview was a masterclass in self-destruction. She made specific, defamatory statements about my character, my ethics, and my fitness for judicial office. She claimed I was using my position to bully community volunteers and suggested that judges who can't follow simple HOA rules shouldn't be making decisions about other people's legal problems. Sarah Beth Morrison read the article with the predatory smile of a lawyer who'd just been handed a winning lottery ticket. She just committed libel against a sitting judge in a major newspaper, she said, highlighting key phrases. That's not just defamation, it's a federal civil rights violation. She's attacked your ability to perform your official duties based on a personal dispute. The special HOA meeting Delilah called for March 15th was packed beyond capacity. The community center hadn't seen this many residents since the annual 4th of July planning meetings, but the energy was different. Electric, with barely contained anger and long overdue courage. She tried to maintain control with parliamentary procedure and procedural motions, but the room wasn't having it. When she called for new business, Kowalski stood up with a document that made her face drain of color. Motion to remove the current HOA president for cause, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found his backbone. Based on financial misconduct, harassment of residents, and violation of fiduciary duties. The motion was seconded immediately, then thirded, then supported by a chorus of voices that had been silent for too long. Delilah tried to rule the motion out of order, but Mrs. Olivia stood up with her shoebox of original HOA documents. According to the 1962 bylaws, which were never legally amended, any homeowner can call for removal of board members with cause. And honey, we've got cause. The vote was 34-3 in favor of removal, with 2 abstentions and 4 people who'd already left in disgust. Delilah's reign of terror was officially over, but I knew she wasn't finished. Cornered animals fight the hardest, and this particular animal still had gasoline and matches. The workshop fire was 3 days away. March 18th, 3:17 a.m. I woke to the sound of hell breaking loose in my backyard. Orange flames were already licking through the workshop roof when I stumbled outside in my pajamas, the acrid smell of burning memories filling my lungs like poison. 4 generations of family history were being consumed in an inferno that turned night into apocalyptic day. The sound was worse than the sight, the crack and pop of grandfather's hand-carved workbench splitting apart, the metallic screech of tools warping in the heat, the whoosh of polyurethane cans exploding like grenades. Everything that had survived the Depression, 2 wars, and 80 years of loving use was being reduced to ash and twisted metal. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left to save. I stood in my bathrobe holding my phone, watching 8 decades of craftsmanship collapse into glowing embers while neighbors gathered in horrified silence. That's when Delilah made her fatal mistake. She appeared at the scene before the fire marshal had even finished unrolling his tape, dressed in a perfectly coordinated athleisure outfit that suggested she'd been awake and prepared for this moment. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, the concerned neighbor rushing to offer comfort and support. "Oh, Ezra, I'm so sorry about all that equipment," she said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "I hope the insurance covers everything. These old workshops can be so dangerous with all those chemicals and electrical issues." Fire Marshal Thompson stopped writing mid-sentence and looked at her with professional interest. "Ma'am, how do you know there was equipment stored in there? The structure's completely collapsed." Delilah's perfectly rehearsed sympathy mask slipped for just a moment. "Well, Everyone knows he had a workshop. We could all hear the power tools running. And you mentioned chemicals. Do you have specific knowledge about what was stored in this building?" I watched her realize she'd revealed information she shouldn't have possessed. The sweet smell of her expensive perfume mixed with smoke and disaster as she tried to backtrack. But Thompson was a 20-year veteran who'd investigated more suspicious fires than she'd attended yoga classes. The arson investigation began within hours. Thompson's examination revealed multiple points of ignition in a burn pattern completely inconsistent with electrical fire. Gasoline residue soaked the concrete floor where grandfather's workbench had stood, and accelerant traces formed a deliberate trail from the door to the back wall. "This wasn't an accident," Thompson told me as he photographed the evidence. "Someone wanted this building gone, and they wanted it gone fast." My security cameras had survived the fire, mounted on the house rather than the garage. The footage was devastating. Two figures in dark clothing approaching the workshop at 2:47 a.m., one carrying what appeared to be a gas can, the other holding something that reflected light like a jewelry bracelet. Marcus Olivia reviewed the enhanced footage with FBI digital forensics experts. The infrared technology revealed details invisible to the naked eye: gait patterns, height measurements, and that damning tennis bracelet that caught the camera's infrared sensors like a beacon. "We've got her," Marcus said, freeze-framing the moment when Delilah's distinctive walk became unmistakable. "Felony arson, conspiracy, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of a federal witness. She just upgraded herself from HOA harassment to federal prison time." The insurance company initially balked at covering the workshop, questioning whether some of grandfather's antique tools were properly documented. The emotional impact was devastating. How do you prove the value of a hand plane that shaped 3 generations of family projects? How do you put a price on tools that survived the Depression? But the community response was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Olivia started a GoFundMe that raised $12,000 in the first day. Neighbors donated tools, lumber, and labor for rebuilding. Even people I'd never met were contributing to what became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The media explosion was immediate and national. HOA president accused of arson against municipal judge made headlines from Denver to CNN. The state attorney general launched a comprehensive investigation into HOA abuse statewide, with our case as the flagship example of systematic corruption. Delilah's panic was palpable and public. She attempted to blame neighborhood troublemakers and outside agitators, even suggesting that I'd burned down my own workshop for sympathy and attention. Each accusation was more desperate than the last, and each one created additional evidence of her deteriorating mental state. Her husband's bank came under FDIC scrutiny when investigators discovered the connection between fraudulent foreclosures and profitable resales. Federal banking regulators don't appreciate institutions that use their lending power to manipulate housing markets for personal profit. The final straw came when Delilah tried to flee. Airport security at Denver International detained her with a one-way ticket to Costa Rica and $47,000 in cash stuffed into designer luggage. The attempted flight made her look guilty of everything we'd accused her of, plus a few crimes we hadn't even considered. The community galvanized around the burned workshop like it was the Alamo of HOA resistance. Neighbors who'd been terrorized for years finally found their voices, sharing stories that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning multiple neighborhoods and dozens of families. Justice was coming, wearing handcuffs and carrying federal charges. March 25th, Municipal Court, Department 3, my courtroom. The irony was so thick you could cut it with one of grandfather's chisels, if they hadn't been reduced to ash a week earlier. Delilah Voss stood in the defendant's dock of the same courtroom where she'd tried to have me removed from the bench, facing charges that would send her to federal prison for the next decade. The formal echo of voices in the wood-paneled courtroom mixed with the nervous energy of packed gallery. Every seat was filled with neighbors, reporters, and victims who'd traveled from across Colorado to witness justice finally being served. Camera crews lined the back wall like a media firing squad, their lenses trained on the woman who'd terrorized communities for years. I'd recused myself from the case, naturally. Visiting Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to my attorney Sarah Beth, presided with the stern competence of someone who'd seen every form of judicial manipulation attempted over 30 years on the bench. "The defendant will rise for arraignment," Judge Morrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Delilah stood slowly, her designer armor replaced by an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her carefully maintained highlights. Gone was the imperious HOA president who'd once commanded community meetings like a corporate boardroom. In her place stood a woman who'd finally been forced to face consequences for her actions. The charges read like a criminal law textbook. Felony arson in the first degree, conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation of federal witnesses, violation of civil rights under color of law, embezzlement of nonprofit funds, wire fraud across state lines. Each charge hit the gallery like a physical blow. Mrs. Olivia dabbed her eyes with tissues while Kowalski gripped his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles went white. These weren't just legal abstractions. They were validation for years of suffering, proof that their tormentor was finally being held accountable. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh laid out the government's case with surgical precision. Financial records showing $87,000 in unauthorized expenditures. Property records documenting systematic harassment leading to 15 forced sales. Security footage of the arson attempt. Bank records proving coordinated fraud across multiple HOA communities. The evidence shows a pattern of criminal enterprise spanning 4 years and affecting over 100 families, Walsh announced, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom. The defendant used her position of trust to systematically terrorize residents, manipulate property values, and profit from the resulting foreclosures. But the most devastating moment came when Mrs. Olivia approached the witness stand carrying her shoebox of original HOA documents. Her arthritic fingers trembled slightly as she placed them before Judge Morrison, but her voice was steady as granite. Your Honor, these are the original 1962 HOA incorporation papers that my late husband helped draft. Every fine, every violation, every threat this woman made was based on rules that were never legally changed. She opened the box with ceremonial precision, extracting documents that the county clerk had authenticated as original filings. According to these founding documents, Mr. Hawthorne's workshop was explicitly protected. Every penalty she imposed was illegal. Every family she drove out was victimized by fraud. The courtroom erupted in whispers that Judge Morrison quickly silenced with her gavel. But the damage to Delilah's defense was nuclear. Every enforcement action she'd taken for 4 years was legally void. Sarah Beth Morrison stood to present the civil case, her voice carrying the righteous anger of someone who'd spent months documenting systematic abuse. The financial liability alone exceeds $180,000 in illegal fines and unauthorized expenditures. But the real damage, the families destroyed, the community terrorized, the basic rights violated, that's immeasurable. The victim impact statements were devastating. The elderly Henderson couple forced to sell their dream retirement home after $8,000 in fabricated violations. The young Patel family, whose children were traumatized by constant harassment over cultural decorations. Working families who'd taken second jobs to pay frivolous fines. Elderly residents who'd gone without medication to afford legal fees. Each story painted the same picture: systematic targeting of vulnerable residents by someone who'd weaponized community governance for personal profit. When reporters cornered Delilah outside the courthouse, her composed facade finally shattered completely. Gone was the smooth-talking HOA president who'd convinced neighbors she was protecting property values. "This is all lies!" she screamed at the cameras, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I was protecting our community from people who don't belong. I was maintaining standards." The raw bigotry in her voice, broadcast live across Colorado, revealed the true motivation behind years of selective enforcement. This hadn't been about rules or property values. It had been about control, discrimination, and greed disguised as community improvement. Judge Morrison's final ruling was comprehensive and devastating. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial, restitution of $2.8 million to affected homeowners, court-appointed receiver to oversee HOA governance transition, and a permanent injunction prohibiting the defendant from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. As handcuffs clicked around Delilah's wrists, the courthouse gallery erupted in relieved applause. 4 years of terror were officially over. Justice, it turned out, looked a lot like an orange jumpsuit and federal prison time. 6 months later, the sound of hammers and laughter echoed from my backyard as neighbors gathered for the workshop rebuilding project that had become a community celebration. The satisfying crack of fresh lumber being fitted together mixed with the smell of new wood and barbecue smoke from 3 different grills set up on the lawn. Mrs. Olivia directed the tool organization with military precision, her shoebox of historical documents now replaced by a clipboard tracking donated equipment. "The router goes in Section C," she called out to Martinez, who'd volunteered his weekends to help. "And someone please tell Kowalski that beer doesn't count as a power tool." The new workshop was bigger than grandfather's original, designed not just for my woodworking, but as a community space where neighborhood kids could learn traditional crafts. Small hands were already learning to sand wood smooth under careful supervision, carrying on grandfather's legacy in ways he never could have imagined. The legal outcomes had exceeded even Marcus Olivia's optimistic predictions. Delilah received 8 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid a longer RICO sentence. Her husband got 15 years for bank fraud and conspiracy. The restitution judgment of $2.8 million was being distributed to affected families across 3 HOA communities, with interest compounding daily. The case became a landmark precedent for prosecuting HOA abuse nationwide. Law schools from Harvard to Stanford now teach Hawthorne v. Voss as required curriculum in property law and civil rights courses. The Colorado legislature passed the Homeowner Protection Act, requiring transparency, term limits, and criminal background checks for HOA board members. But the most satisfying outcome was watching families return to their neighborhood. The restitution fund allowed 12 families to buy back homes they'd lost to Delilah's foreclosure scheme. The Hendersons, who'd been forced to sell their retirement dream house, were now living 3 doors down from their original home, surrounded by grandchildren and garden gnomes that nobody dared cite for violations. The new HOA governance was everything Delilah's regime wasn't: transparent, democratic, and actually focused on community improvement. Monthly meetings were public, financial records were posted online, and board members faced mandatory term limits. The contrast was so stark that neighboring HOAs started adopting our reforms voluntarily. Netflix acquired documentary rights to our story for an undisclosed sum that I donated entirely to a scholarship fund for children from families affected by HOA abuse. Burning Down the House, an HOA Story, premiered to critical acclaim and sparked legislative reform efforts in 15 states. The ripple effects continued expanding. The FBI's HOA task force, formed after our case, had uncovered similar fraud schemes in 43 communities across 7 states. Delilah's operation hadn't been unique, just uniquely sloppy in targeting a judge who knew how to build criminal cases. On a personal level, the experience had transformed my understanding of judicial responsibility. Presiding over traffic court and small claims cases carried new weight when I remembered how legal systems could be weaponized against vulnerable families. Every case now reminded me that behind legal abstractions were real people whose lives could be destroyed by abuse of authority. The annual Community Justice Day festival had become our neighborhood's biggest celebration, complete with a woodworking demonstration booth that was always packed with curious kids. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Delilah's attempt to shut down my workshop had resulted in teaching traditional crafts to an entire generation. Mrs. Olivia knocked on my door one evening with fresh cookies and news that another HOA president in Jefferson County was targeting military families with the same systematic harassment tactics Delilah had perfected. Sarah Beth Morrison was already building a case file, and the affected community was organizing resistance using our playbook. Harold would be so proud, she said, settling into the porch chair where we'd planned strategy sessions that toppled a criminal enterprise. He always said bad people count on good people staying quiet. We sure proved him wrong about the quiet part. The practical lessons from our victory had spread far beyond Colorado. Always request HOA financial records. It's your legal right. Document everything systematically. Organize neighbors before fighting alone. Use state ombudsman offices for free assistance. And remember that bullies count on isolation and fear to maintain power. As sunset painted the rebuilt workshop golden, I reflected on how justice had prevailed through community action, legal knowledge, and refusing to be intimidated by petty tyrants. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments. You might inspire our next investigation. Hit subscribe because we're building a community that fights back against abuse of authority everywhere. Remember, they count on you staying silent. Don't.